Okay, wait. What? All right. That's enough. That's enough. That's enough. That's enough. That's enough. All right. Final countdown. Cold War theme song. There you go. Welcome to Causes, Course, and Consequences of the Cold War through the presidencies of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy. We are starting period 8, 1945 to 1980. This is a lecture that's going to cover just the Cold War aspects of these three presidents. We will go back to these three presidents, especially when we talk about civil rights, but I believe I'll probably do that in class. I'm not sure yet if I'll do a YouTube lecture on that or not. Hopefully you have your key concepts, and there is a worksheet for those of you in my class. This is going to be the basis of a classroom discussion graded lecture. So make sure you have that worksheet, the 3 C's, the 3 cause, course, consequences of the Cold War, and that you're able to answer all these various questions. So yeah, let's get started into this. Now, we think of the world, right? The United States basically, in a lot of respects, is kind of already, I don't want to use the word conquered, colonized. We definitely have Coca-Cola'd the world, right? The whole world. By the way, this is from the 1950s, a Time magazine from the 1950s, and I love this. You know, the Coke is telling baby Earth, you know, just shh, just drink it, just drink it, just drink it, drink a little, drink it all, drink it all, drink it all, right? The whole world basically knows what Coca-Cola is. The whole world knows what Levi's jean is, what rock and roll is, who Elvis Presley is, what Walt Disney Studios are, right? Marvel and DC, Superman, Spider-Man, Batman, Captain America. It's just the whole world has come to know American culture. Good thing, bad thing. There's really no way to define that, but it's stuff like this that starts to antagonize individuals who are more of a, let's say, a communist type background. A lot of these little things is what will antagonize what becomes the Soviet Union. So we're going to get into causes of this Cold War era. If you think of long-term causes, causes are always long-term, short-term, and then there's some kind of an immediate spark. We can go back to the beginning of the 20th century, where the United States was first getting on the scene with Theodore Roosevelt, his big stick policy, right? We're going to be a police officer of the world, speak softly, carry a big stick. And they put America on the scene, on a worldwide scene. Remember, he becomes the first president to win a Nobel Peace Prize. He negotiates an end of the war between Japan and Russia. So America is starting to become more and more, on the world stage. Then by World War I, Woodrow Wilson, who did not want to be a foreign policy president, but is forced to because of the war, he wants to make the world safe for democracy. He wants to bring about what he calls a new world order. He wants to end basically monarchies in Europe and bring about more democratic but progressive liberal democratic reform. It's at that moment as well that the Soviet Union begins during World War I. And the United States does not recognize them as a legitimate country, thereby bringing, right from the beginning, animosity between the two countries. We get to World War II. Russia, the Soviet Union, is supposed to be an ally, but eventually they sign a non-aggression pact with the Germans. Then it looked like they were not going to be an ally. Then they turn into an ally because the Germans, backstab them and they backstab them and blah, 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 blah. Now they're an ally with Great Britain, with the United States. As the war is coming to an end, FDR preaches his open world concept. Free trade and things like that. He wants to bring back not the League of Nations, but he's going to establish the United Nations. And all of these things lead to animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union and how we dealt with this concept of who will be a leading force in the world. We get into our key concepts here, 8.1.1a. A lot of what we're going to talk about with the Cold War is going to come from key concept period 8, 8.1, Roman numeral 1, a lot of it is going to come from this particular concept. We see here that the war has come to an end, and there's a lot of tensions now that are starting to happen with these once wartime allies. We have Western democracies in the Soviet Union. Well, what happens? The United States develops a foreign policy based on three things: collective security, NATO, the United Nations, right? NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They want international aid. That becomes the Marshall Plan. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Rebuilding Europe after the war. And of course, economic institutions. We'll talk about Bretton Woods Agreement. Bretton Woods Agreement, Bretton Woods is a city in New Hampshire in the United States. During the war, FDR called for all of the allies and countries that are at war with Germany and Japan to meet at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Soviet Union was invited. They did send representatives, but they quickly left because they were preaching Keynesian economics to the world. They were wanting the whole world to go on a gold standard for trade, to invigorate trade in the world again, and for countries, democratic countries, to employ Keynesian economics. The Soviet Union immediately found that, obviously, a slap in their face because they're a communist nation. They don't practice Keynesian economics, and they don't want a gold system, so they will not participate in this. Again, one of these causes, this is more of a short-term cause because these things are happening within a few years or a decade or so of this Cold War. Consequences of these tensions are going to happen as a result. Germany is going to be divided. We're going to get a East Germany and a West Germany. Right? We had the Allies at first. You had the British zone. You had the French zone. You had the US zone and the Russian zone. But eventually, all of this becomes West Germany, the democratic country of Germany. This becomes East Germany, the communistic government. But Berlin is right there. Berlin, the capital of all of Germany, gets divided into two. You get a West Berlin and an East Berlin. These are consequences that are going to come here at the beginning of the Cold War. With them not figuring out how to get along, eventually Berlin is always going to become a problem. There's always this fear that the Soviets will invade West Berlin. If they do this, that's World War III. So a lot of this tensions will continue on now for decades, and they won't be able to do anything, to fix it. But let's get into the presidents of this time period. Oh, I'm sorry, we won't do that. We're going to look at this here first. We got to understand containment. Again, key concept 8.1, Roman numeral 1. Now we're in B. Right? We're very concerned about the ideology of the Soviets. So the United States seeks to contain. Containment policy is what we're going to call what every one of these presidents do. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, we're even going to get later on to Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ford, Carter, even Ronald Reagan. They all have some kind of a containment policy against the Soviet Union. Where do we get this expression, containment? Well, it came from something known as the long telegram. The war comes to an end in 1945. Truman is perplexed. Why won't those Soviets play nice? We're supposed to be allies. There's a guy that lives in Moscow, an American diplomat, a foreign diplomat in Moscow. George Kennan is his name. George Kennan. So they decided to send a telegram to him. He's lived in Moscow for a couple of years. He's gotten to know the Russian people. He's an American diplomat. He serves in the American embassy there. So they sent him a telegram asking him, what can you tell us about the Russians? It became known as the long telegram because he sent back an 8,000-word dissertation. I tell you, again, 8,000 words.
Finish him!
Urgh! I can only imagine Truman trying to read that. But in that document, George Kennan begins to talk about what becomes this idea of containment policy. You must stop the spread of communism. You don't want to go to war with it. Contain it, isolate it, quarantine it. do not allow it to spread. This became the role of every one of these presidents. We'll talk later about Korea. We're going to get a lot into Vietnam later on, and there's obviously things that are going to happen in the 70s and the 80s we'll get into. We call these proxy wars, where the United States and the Soviet Union don't actually fight each other. They'll do it through other countries. That's what a proxy war is. That's there in letter C, direct and indirect military confrontation. Later on, we're going to get into something, it's not going to be in this PowerPoint, but détente. That's Richard Nixon. We start getting these SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation talks. All right, there's going to be a 1 and a 2. We'll get more into that later on when we get to Richard Nixon. But you can see that this is going to last a very long time, this Cold War. 1945 to the late 1980s, and I think the Soviet Union comes to an end about 91, 92. Now we'll talk about Truman. So Truman's presidency, 45. Remember, he takes over when FDR dies in April of 1945. He wins his own election in 1948, and that's the only election he will win. But he is the beginning of containment policy for our presidents. As we'll also come to find out, he is the beginning of civil rights for our president. We get this thing that starts off known as the Truman Doctrine. After the war, the countries of Greece and Turkey are in a lot of trouble. The war obviously has devastated their economy. There's a lot of uprising in their countries and a lot of communist revolutionary plots in their countries. Well, how do you help Greece and Turkey without actually going to war? Well, Truman will say, it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. We know within those countries there are minorities who are trying to overthrow the government. The Soviet Union is also putting out outside pressure on Greece and Turkey. So the United States gives $10 million to these countries to try to help them. This became known as the Truman Doctrine. Very much, you think of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Now this president has his own doctrine. We are going to financially begin to help countries fight communism without sending our own troops. This then becomes the basis for what eventually is going to be known as the Marshall Plan. George Marshall was the head of the Joint Chief of Staffs of Generals during World War II. He is the boss of Eisenhower. All right. He becomes the Secretary of State under Truman. He will go to Europe and see the devastation of Europe. And he'll realize that communism is spreading like a cancer. There's a chance that these countries that are in economic disarray could fall to the sway of communism. A plan is proposed that the United States will basically reconstruct. So sometimes known as a reconstruction plan. Let's see. Does the United States have any experience with reconstruction? Peter Griffin got it. Yeah, they have a lot of experience with reconstructing. So the Marshall Plan, $12 billion to rebuild Europe, rebuild their infrastructure, rebuild schools, build roads, bring in theater and shopping and restaurants, showcase what capitalism and democracy can do for your country. Japan even gets a piece of this. They offered a piece of it to the Soviet Union, and of course, they rejected it, right? So now the United States is taking a position of we will try to financially keep communism out of Western Europe. Well, again, as I said earlier, you've got this East and West Germany and East and West Berlin. Now you have Stalin versus Truman. Stalin decides, as I told you, a consequence of this is now going to be Berlin. In 1948, Stalin is going to cut off West Berlin from the rest of the world. He cuts off their water, their electric, their oil. He cuts them off, that part of the city. Remember, we're talking about a city here. Berlin is a divided city right there in the midst of an entire country, which is East Germany, a communist country. He cuts off West Berlin. surrounds it, doesn't allow anything in or out. He's going to starve these people to death, millions of people, unless Truman gives up Berlin. Truman will not. Becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. The United States, along with the British, will fly every day over communist-controlled East Germany, and they'll drop supplies, food, water, medicine, clothing, every day for more than a year. These planes come in, and Truman dares Stalin, dares him, shoot one of our planes down. Shoot a plane down. I have armies here ready to go. World War III is on like a Donkey Kong. This plane, by the way, has a very special stripe on it and flew very low. You might not notice, but these are all children here. This was known as the candy plane. They would drop tons and tons of candy. But Gustav had better make sure he's nowhere near when that crate comes down. Boom! Nah, they had parachutes on the tree. Could you imagine that? Gustav, run for your life! Candy crates! No. That's just a joke. That's just a joke. I know, Peter. It's a funny joke. It's a funny joke. So the Berlin Airlift, again, make sure you know this, right? These are one of these consequences for Truman, right? He's got to defend West Berlin because we are not going to get along with the Soviets at all. There's also some other issues with Truman's presidentship. As a Democrat, right? Truman is a Democrat. Everyone wasn't paying attention. There is a civil war taking place in China. Mao Zedong, the communist leader, Chiang Kai-shek, is a nationalist. The United States obviously supports the nationalist. But in 1949, the communists take the country. Everyone blames the Democrats for this. Everyone will blame Truman and the Democratic Party. You might want to try your best to hold on to that little bit of nugget. In a few weeks, we'll be talking about Vietnam, and that will explain a lot of why LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, not LeBron James, put so much effort into trying to save Vietnam. Because Democrats are now constantly going to be blamed anytime communism gets a foothold in the world. Because China fell to the communists. By the way, Chiang Kai-shek's people, they went to an island called Formosa, and they renamed it something. Someone who can tell me what that name is when we have our discussions. Just think about that. You're getting points for these discussions. What? Island of Formosa is now something else. Anyways, then Korea happens. Korea, I don't want to get too much into Korea. I'll probably do a little something in class on Korea, a little 20-minute little something on Korea. It's a country that's divided at the 38th parallel line. The north is communism. The south is democracy. I think you kind of know this because, hey, they're still divided. And North Korea surprise attacks South Korea. Took everyone by surprise. Truman doesn't want to declare war. Right? Our last declared war is World War II. We have the United Nations now. Truman, working through the United Nations, gets the United Nations basically declare this, for lack of a better expression, a police action, where the United States will take the brunt force of this, but Canada, Australia, Great Britain, France, other countries are involved as well, under the leadership of Douglas MacArthur. I will definitely do this in class because Douglas MacArthur is going to be fired because of this. In fact, maybe somebody should ask me while we're in class, hey, why was Douglas MacArthur fired? For those of you who are listening, you don't have me, well, ask your teacher. Or, God forbid, you should actually read a book. I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean anything by that. We'll move on. Whoa, look at this. Here we go. Consequences again. 811D. This decolonization of the world is starting to happen. We have national movements all over the world. Asia, right? There was a national movement. Africa sees a national movement. The Middle East. Everyone wants to take sides during the Cold War. Will these countries support The Soviet system, will these countries become allies of democracy? Everyone is taking side in the 1950s, 1960s. As I said, we had NATO forms, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, SATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and the Soviets came back with the Warsaw Pact. Satellite nations. Warsaw is in Poland. So all of the communist nations in Eastern Europe formed the Warsaw Pact. Truman's popularity will plummet at this time period. He could have ran for another election. Truman is the last president who could have ran for as many terms as he wanted to. But his popularity is really in the toilet at this time. We now go back and realize Truman was one of our better presidents. But in the time period, people were just tired. And they wanted a strong Republican leadership. And they wanted Ike. That's his nickname, Dwight Eisenhower. His nickname was Ike. And they would say, I like Ike. And he's the general of D-Day. So he wins this election in 52, and the Korean conflict doesn't come to an end. By the way, there is no end to the Korean War. We signed an armistice. Technically, we are still at war with North Korea. That's why we got a guy over there threatening to bomb us. Anyways, moving on. What is the course or containment policy for Eisenhower? He's going to use two thoughts. Brinksmanship. This is fun. Brinksmanship. Let's keep the world constantly at the brink of nuclear annihilation. Hey, what a party now!
Finish him!
Exactly. Brinksmanship will have a fleet of super bombers. These super bombers that are loaded with atomic weapons on it, that are constantly flying at the Arctic Circle and in other places in the world, and can be anywhere they need to within a matter of maybe 20 minutes or an hour, and start bombing. Constantly flying our Air Force. He beefs up the Air Force at this time period, and he actually cuts down the Army. We get something called SAC developed at this time period, Strategic Air Force Command, which is still with us. He develops his domino theory of containment. If you allow one country to fall to communism like dominoes, then a bunch of them fall. But we get into a massive space race while he is president of the United States because the Russians have launched Sputnik. Right? They beat the United States to space, and America went crazy over this. They passed the National Defense Act, which out of this, then you get the National Education Act. Science and math in our high schools. We got to get more scientists. We get NASA is developed, right? We got to get to the moon. We got to beat the Russians. We got to get our satellites up there. The Russians got to get more satellites up there. Everyone now, technology has changed in the 1950s. We're in the atomic age. The transistor has been invented. Technology is shrinking. Eventually, this is going to lead to the microchip. All of this. Television is with us now. Television is a big-time technological advancement. Just crazy. The beginning of computers are happening. This massive space race begins during Eisenhower's presidency. The Interstate Highway Act, which you can see some of it we'll talk about an economic and a social function as well here in the concept 8.3, but it originally has a military concept to it. He's going to build these massive interstates, I-95, I-75, I-10, all these massive interstates all over the United States, but many of them were wide enough to land airplanes on them. They were also convenient to transport troops. What if we're ever invaded? We've got to get our military easier access to and from various strategic locations in the United States. So these massive highways were built. But we'll also talk about this later on. This will spur some of the biggest economic growth in our history. Again, Brinksmanship. John Foster Dulles is his Secretary of State, or Dulles. If you ever flown into Washington, D.C., you might have flown into Dulles Airport. They used to have this expression, dull, duller, Dulles. Right? It tells you a little bit about his personality. He helped orchestrate this Brinksmanship policy, but Brinksmanship is a failure. The Hungarian Revolt, The Hungarians revolt against communism in 1956, believing the United States, Great Britain are going to come to their aid. The Soviets roll in tanks to put down this revolt. The army goes in. And Eisenhower doesn't do anything. If he attacks in Hungary, that means he's attacking the Warsaw Pact. All those countries go to war. NATO goes to war. And it's a war that won't last very long. You can threaten brinkmanship, but it's obvious you're not actually going to do it. Then the Suez Crisis happens, October 29th through November 7th of 1956. One of the most tense moments in our history, and we forget all about it. We get the Suez Canal. It's in Egypt. Nasser has become the president or the leader of Egypt. Not really sure whose side Nasser is on. Is he with the Russians? He's with the Americans. He wants to build power dams, hydro dams along the Nile River. The United States thinks about helping him, but the Soviet Union offers help immediately. Well, this angers the United States. It angers Great Britain. It angers France. But Nasser decides, well, you know what? The heck with you guys. The Suez Canal at this time period, which leads from the Mediterranean into the Gulf here, the Gulf of Suez. Gulf of Suez eventually gets into the Red Sea, eventually gets into the Indian Ocean. It was owned by the British and the French. They owned it. Nasser, what we say, nationalizes it. He takes it away from them and he says it's now an Egyptian property. And he closes off trade for the British and the French. Without telling the United States, Great Britain and France invades Egypt. And they did it they got a third country to help them. Israel. Israel came in with their air force and destroyed the Egyptian air force as it was still sitting on airfields. That's not good. Now you're at a moment where the Soviet Union is threatening war, the Warsaw Pact is going to force, Muslim countries are thinking of war, and Eisenhower is angry that Britain and France did this and didn't even tell him. So Eisenhower orders all oil to be cut off to the British and the French. Because at that time, the United States was still the leader in exporting oil in the world. And they cut off all the oil supply of the British and the French. That's what eventually got Great Britain and France out of there, and a war is averted. We're going to get something called the Eisenhower Doctrine. It's going to come out of this. Any countries in the Middle East that need help financially, the United States will be there. There's an issue in Lebanon that takes place, and Eisenhower gets involved in there. He doesn't want Middle Eastern countries to get persuaded by the communists. So he offers financial aid, the Eisenhower Doctrine. This little thing is happening in Vietnam. There's my little I Like Ike pen. Again, we're going to do a whole lesson on the Vietnam War. We'll come back to this. The French are in there first. It's some of the French Indochina War. And I'll do a whole lecture on that. But that is also taking place during this time period while Eisenhower is president. I'm going to skip that for now. Consequences. Well, something happens at home. When I say at home, in the United States, you get a second Red Scare takes place. Starts in the Truman years, culminates in the Eisenhower years. Americans are getting beefed up by our foreign policy, being so afraid of communism and communism spreading that as a consequence, we become afraid of each other. Right? Americans debate policies and methods designed to expose suspected communists within the United States. Both parties supported the broader strategy of containing communism, so it made Americans afraid of Americans. You get the House Committee of Un-American Activities, which a young Richard Nixon is in charge of. You're going to get American loyalty oath boards are going to be developed, where Americans will have to swear their loyalty to the United States. And the biggest target that they looked at was Hollywood, movies. They felt a lot of actors, directors, writers were communists, and they were creating movies that you went in that movie eating your popcorn, drinking your Coca-Cola, But you came out of there wanting vodka. All of a sudden, I need vodka. Well, the movie must have somehow or another subvert me to communism. The Hollywood 10 are 10 individuals who are ordered to come before Congress and testify if they were communist or not. They plead the fifth. And then this whole shenanigans take place where Hollywood begins to descend upon itself. Actors and directors who don't want to lose their jobs begin to go to Congress and say this person's a communist and that person's a communist. It's a pretty weird moment for the Hollywood people. This becomes known as McCarthyism. We'll talk a lot about Joseph McCarthy, a young senator from Wisconsin who starts what we call these communist witch hunts. It's a witch hunt. Well, this one was a witch hunt. It ruined lives. People's lives were ruined over this. It doesn't come to an end until Eisenhower is president. But then we get the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg trial. They worked during the Manhattan Project. Julius, he didn't believe that the Soviet Union should be kept in the dark. Other people, including Ethel's brother, they began to take some of these secrets and sneak them out to the Soviet Union so they can build their own atomic bomb. I'll talk about some of this more in class as well. Julius and Ethel become the first husband and wife to go to the electric chair. They're going to be found guilty of espionage and sedition against the United States. Their penalty will be death. Others that will be involved in this did not get the death penalty because they turned state evidence against them. So this is often very controversial what happens to them. There's enough evidence to think that Julius was a traitor. It's very circumstantial for Ethel. On his deathbed, I want to say about 5-6 years ago now, her brother died, who her brother turned against her in this trial. But on his deathbed, he said that he lied. Was he simply doing that because he was afraid of where he was going to go after his death? I don't know. But this is a controversial moment. The United States executes a husband and a wife. The first and only time that'll happen. Eisenhower is going to leave, right? He's a two-term president. He is the first president to serve under what's called the 22nd Amendment, where presidents can only serve for 2 terms now. They don't want another FDR who got 4 terms. So Eisenhower was the first one to serve under that. This man had served this country for a long time, much like George Washington. He had been a general. He had seen battle, much like George Washington. He had served his country then as a president, much like George Washington. And like Washington, he felt he was duty-bound to give us a little bit of parting advice and wisdom. Washington is the only farewell address that's mentioned by name in the key concepts. Beware, well, he never said beware of entangling alliances. That's actually Jefferson, but he does tell us to stay away from these permanent alliances with the Europeans. He also warned us a lot about political parties. Eisenhower warns us about what he calls, and this is in the key concept, so his farewell address is alluded here, the military-industrial complex. Tony Stark, right? LexCorp. Any other comic book reference I could make. Remember, I keep telling you, the United States government never makes any weapon. We contract that out to private industry. They've now become a military-industrial complex. He'll famously say in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. These entities exist to make money. So they are now building massive weapons of destruction, and they are selling it to whoever wants it. All over the earth, the military-industrial complex has emerged. It is still with us. Eisenhower is trying to tell us, if we're not careful, we're going to keep building weapons, and we are going to annihilate each other. Excellent words of wisdom. We'll end it with Kennedy, causes, course, and consequences. His containment policy became known as flexible response. He didn't want massive super fleets of bombers. He wanted smaller paramilitary groups. We get the Green Berets are developed at this time period. And decades later, you get things like the Navy SEALs, smaller op groups instead of large military confrontations. His Secretary of Defense, who helps develop this, is Robert McNamara. We're going to talk a lot about him in class as well. Kennedy will meet. Now, Stalin is dead. So they don't want another dictator in the Soviet Union. So they start creating this role of a president who's really a puppet. Nikita Khrushchev is the first. I'll talk a lot about him too later on. An interesting character, Nikita Khrushchev. They meet in Vienna, and Khrushchev yells and screams at Kennedy, and then within a couple of months, they begin to build this Berlin Wall. I have a lot to show you because I've been to Berlin. I have a lot of pictures. I'm going to show you some pictures of what this really looked like. They build this wall to keep people from East Berlin to get out so they can go to West Berlin and escape the country. And a lot of people are going to die here. A lot of people over the course of decades will be shot dead trying to escape at the Berlin Wall. Kennedy will go to West Berlin. He'll give his famous Ich nein ein Berliner, I am a Berliner speech, where democracy has its many faults and many failings, but we never had to build a wall to keep our people in, right? West Berlin becomes the showcase of democracy. The United States will pour all kinds of money into West Berlin. And if you ask me a story about West Berlin that a college professor mentioned to me, that might be a good thing for you to do. Don't forget to do that. It's a pretty interesting story. But now in 8.1, Roman numeral 1, letter E, we get this competition is extending now to Latin America. Right? Latin American countries are starting to, vacillate with communism. Can we allow communism? We have the Monroe Doctrine. We have the Roosevelt corollary to that doctrine. We're not supposed to allow that to happen. Cuba becomes the issue of the day. First, there's the Bay of Pigs issue, where under Eisenhower, Fidel Castro has conquered Cuba. He's overthrown the government. He's now the leader there. He's turning to communism. Under Eisenhower, they're training Cuban insurrectos in the Florida Everglades, and they're going to invade. They think Richard Nixon's going to win the election of 1960. It did not happen. The Democrat Kennedy did. Kennedy is basically talked into signing the agreement. We're going to invade Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. These about 2,000 plus Cubans are going to go over there. Then the United States Air Force is going to give them support. Kennedy says yes. Then when they go to attack, Kennedy says no. And those Cubans wound up meeting some close to 15,000, 20,000 Cuban manned army with cannons and jet fighters. And within 15, 20 minutes, it was all over. They took all those Cubans hostages. And a few months later, Kennedy gave medical supplies to Cuba in order to release those hostages. So Kennedy looks weak on communism. But not too long later, we get the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union is putting nuclear missiles in Cuba that within less than 10 minutes, 80% of the United States would be gone. 80% within 10 minutes. 13 days. 13 days. He stood up. Kennedy stands up to Khrushchev, the Russians, to Cuba, and he finally gets them to get those missiles out of there. Again, we're going to do something in class on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but this kind of brings an end to this PowerPoint lecture. I do have some terms for you to know. Make sure you know about these. Make sure you can talk about them. Make sure you can explain them. You can pause here and look at it. And I will see everybody, I guess, when I see you. Have a good night, right?